Hello, and welcome to Policy Voices, the podcast from Friends of Europe. I'm your host, Sabina Șancu, and this week on the podcast, I'm really honored to have had MEP Thomas Pellerin-Carlin join to speak about energy. MEP Pellerin-Carlin is a member of the S&D group in the European Parliament, and he sits on the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, also known as ITRE. But before joining the European Parliament, he was an energy researcher, and he also taught courses related to this. So my conversation with him really taught me a lot about energy, and I hope that it's also going to teach you a little bit. And if you already know a lot about energy, I'm hoping it gives you a fresh perspective. Some of the topics that we discussed with MEP Thomas Pellerin-Carlin are the possibility of creating an energy union, the two big elephants in the room, Russia and the US, but also looking at the fossil fuel lobby and the chance that renewables might have to really enter our market. For the last question, he also gives his approach on what would be some of his immediate steps to further the green transition. And I think it's a really beautiful story of him connecting with his constituency. So without spoiling anything more, here's my conversation with MEP Thomas Pellerin-Carlin from S&D. With anything that the EU wants to really regulate and have like a better hold of, some powers need to get transferred to the EU level from member states, and then we also need agencies to help us create policy and enforce it. And energy has really been a priority for the EU, especially in the last few years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I cannot help but wonder, why do we not have an energy agency at an EU level yet to control the supply and the security of our energy?
There are several elements there, and I think one of that element has to go with the word you chose to frame your question, which was a transfer of sovereignty or of power. And this is often the way the European integration has been portrayed, as the idea that you transfer power from the national level to the EU level. To be honest, I think that's not the right word. It's more, I would rather framing it in with the view of what is the best level of governance where democracies should exercise their own sovereignty. And that changes a little bit the conversation. What we need to achieve, we need to achieve many things, but one of them is energy security, making sure that at the end of the day, people have access to the heat, the mobility, and the electricity and the cooling that they need to function. Whether we're talking about people like my mom who is living in her house and needs that, or whether we're talking about essential industrial and economic activities like data centers, for instance. We need cooling and electricity in order to be able to work and deliver the type of services that we ask from them. Since most of the people, especially national ministers, think still in terms of that idea of transfer, and they think that they're going to lose control, rather than seeing this as being the only way for them to retain control. The only way in this world of bullies for national governments to be able still to preserve the national interest is actually to work for European integration. There is essentially no other way. And then the question is, what do we choose to integrate? Where do we choose to exercise our sovereignty at the EU level? When do we choose to exercise it at the national level? And then in each member state, do we decide to exercise that sovereignty at a regional level or local level, city level, depending on this. So if we look at energy, for instance, what I've been advocating for, I guess for 10 years, I've been in politics for a year and a half, but I was a researcher before, was the creation of a European Energy Information Agency. And I insist on the information. Like, it's not the idea to create a European agency that would be something that will take away power from the member states, but just be able to collect data and make sure that all member states have access to reliable data, and that also that data can be accessed by private actors, investors, private companies, researchers, interested citizens too. That would already be quite valuable. But obviously, energy became a European priority too late. We had to wait until 2009 with the Lisbon Treaty to get a specific legal basis in the treaties for the EU to act on energy. So we kind of missed that trend of creating agencies, and now nobody wants to create an agency anymore. And so what I've been advocating here is to support the creation of energy information service inside the European Environment Agency. Like with 30 good people, we could have a lot of better data, and this would be tremendously helpful for member states, including to do foresight on energy security, for instance.
I'm thinking about the security aspect of this as well, because one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we have right now is our dependency on Russian oil and gas, and also the fact that we are giving them money by buying it to support their war. So I'm wondering, in your vision, what would be the most important 3 steps that we can take to wean ourselves off of Russian energy as soon as possible?
I think the first step is to acknowledge that our current energy system is, pardon my French, but fucked up. It really is. Like if we zoom out, if we were an AI, or if we were an alien coming on Earth, and would be looking at the European energy system and be thinking like, so you guys chose to make sure that 2/3 of your energy comes from oil and gas. But you've been knowing theoretically since the 19th century and very accurately since the 1970s that burning that oil and gas is destroying the only planet where humankind can live. Okay, that is pretty fucked up as an approach. That is, however, not unique to Europe. Like an alien or AI could say the same thing about China or the US. What is specific to Europe, however, is that we don't have that oil and gas. That is not a domestic energy source for us. We import 90% of our gas and 97% of our oil. And this is worsening. The little oil that remains in Romania and the little gas that remains in the Netherlands, it's nothing already. And that is specifically European. The main energy source in China is domestic coal. The main energy source in the US is domestic oil and domestic shale gas. It would be the same for Nigeria. In Uruguay, it's hydropower. Most continents in the world have access to large amounts of at least one of the 3 fossil fuels, most of the time, actually, the 3 of them. And then there is the second element, which is where do we source that gas and oil? And essentially, we source it by buying directly from countries like Russia. That's what has been the case for the last decades. And if you were to ask an AI whether Europe is on the side of Russia or on the side of Ukraine, and you ask specifically for that AI to look at a KPI, a key performance indicator, which would be financial flows, the AI will answer that Europe is on the side of Russia. Why? Because there has been more money going from the EU to Russia than from the EU to Ukraine. Because the amount of money that has been paid by fossil fuel importers to pay for Russian oil and gas since February 2022 has been higher than the amount of aid, military, humanitarian, financial, and otherwise, and also the individual donations that people like me and many others in Europe have given to the Ukrainian NGOs, to the Ukrainian government, to the Ukrainian army. So yeah, that's pretty fucked up also. So we are in a situation where I guess the first thing we need to do is to realize that we've been feeding the hand that wants to kill us, which here again is pretty fucked up. And the final point of realization is also realizing that this has been destroying our economies regularly. In Europe, we have at least four economic crises that are linked to fossil fuel dependence. The first one is the 1973 first oil shock that essentially broke the knees of the Western European economies. We went from 4, 5, 6% GDP growth to 0 or 2 at best, and so like that kind of seismic change was relating to the first oil shock. And then we had a second oil shock in 1979, and we had a third oil shock in 2008, which has not really been recognized as such by European leaders because it was at the same time as the financial crisis from the US with the subprime mortgage. There was also the so-called grid debt crisis. And so a lot of the political and media discourse was around this is a grid debt crisis. But at the same time, we had an oil barrel at $140, which is the highest price we've ever had in human history. And that played a massive role because it was actually a third oil shock. And those three things were intertwined: the US financial crisis, the third oil shock, and the Greek public debt situation. And a lot of the media and political focus was on, this is a Greek public debt thing. without realizing that there was a big energy component that was also important. And the fourth one we had is the 2021 gas shock. It's like an oil shock, just on gas. And it was, to my knowledge, never called as a gas shock by anyone who is a EU policymaker except for me, because I was still a researcher back then. I already called that a gas shock as soon as October 2021. And what happened then was that Gazprom, the Russian company, chose to drastically decrease its gas sales to Europe in the summer of 2021. So I insist on that because that is before the Putin's so-called special military operation in 2022. So the first step we need to do is to recognize this. The second thing is what we're currently doing. It's adopting what we call here the Russian gas regulation proposal, which is the proposal that the Commission made before the summer to protect the European internal market from further Russian energy interference and to make sure that we stop importing Russian gas as a result. In Parliament, we have a broad coalition to accept that and be even faster in terms of timelines, and we will also to include oil there. And I insist on the fact that this is not linked to the full-scale war on Ukraine. Because here again, the most recent super big Russian interference in the European energy market was in the summer of 2021, before the full-scale invasion. At the same time, there are discussions in the Council on sanctions, and those sanctions are linked to the full-scale war, while our regulation is really linked to the protection of the internal market, to protect ourselves from, let's say, manipulation coming from the Russian trade and energy policies. And even if they had not invaded or tried to invade, rather, we would need to still adopt this exact same regulation, because Russia has been manipulating energy for more than 2 decades now. And at some point we need to act. And the third important step that we need to take is to understand that doing this is good. We understand how fucked up our current and fossil fuel energy mix is. Second, we protect ourselves from Russian energy interference. But then the third thing is, what is our long-term strategy? It's what I call, because I served in the French military, and I therefore call that the theory of victory. And victory is a word that we don't use enough, I think, in European policymaking. When it comes to the war that Putin has started against us, against the European civilization, against the European way of life, we need to have a theory of victory. Part of that has to do with the military, but the military, like the military aid to Ukraine or the so-called drone war that we are discussing, are super important. I would rather name them as theories of non-defeat. This is how we make sure that we are not defeated. And here again, to win, first you need to make sure that you're not defeated. But this is not enough. So I'm more of a rugby guy than a football guy, but I've been told that it also works in football. You need a good defense and you need a good offense. You need both. Obviously, our defense is mostly military. Our offense will not be military for obvious reasons. Then we need to understand what makes Russia strong. What is the source of Putin's energy and power? And it is oil and gas. Last year, in 2024, the Russian oil and gas revenues were 250 billion euros. That same year, the Russian military budget was 140. So you don't need to be like a fields medalist to understand that if you manage to decrease the Russian fossil fuel revenues, you will force them to decrease their military efforts. And people were already talking about Russia becoming North Korea on steroids. The Russia becoming North Korea is Putin's choice, but the steroids part depends on us, because the amount of steroids that this Russia has 100% depends on its capacity to sell oil and gas at a high price. So obviously, we need to act domestically, but we need to invest in energy efficiency, renewables at home in Europe, and do that in such a way that we can also work with other countries, especially other democracies in the world that are currently dependent on Russian coal, oil, and gas, for them to be able to choose other energies, and especially to choose European clean technologies in order to develop an alternative to oil and gas coming from Russia.
I'm thinking about this bigger global perspective about trying to stop these dependencies, because the EU has tried to look to other sources for energy. It's looked to authoritarian governments like Azerbaijan, but most recently it's looked towards the US with a pledge of $750 billion for American energy products by the end of Trump's reign, if that ever happens. So I'm wondering, is this cooperation, let's say, with the US, a dangerous new dependency for the EU?
It is a dangerous one. It is a less dangerous one than the Russian dependency. We live in a world of bullies. We live in a world that was not the world that Europeans expected to see in the 90s. I myself, I was born in 89. I did most of my study in the noughties, and still a lot of my teachers were teaching me about what the US historian Tim Snyder calls the politics of inevitability. Essentially, we were taught that the future is going to be, more of the good things that we already had. It's going to be more democratic. It's going to be more free market. And I remember people that were EU officials at then that were saying, we've included China in the WTO, in the World Trade Organization. We have, with Hong Kong, we're going to see Hong Kong inject the virus of democracy inside China, and China will become slowly but surely more democratic as it becomes more of a free market economy, and there is a rise of the middle class, etc., etc. And this, now I understand, like, speaking about that in 2025, we're like, they're crazy. But that was by far not even the mainstream view, was the hegemonic view in the European Union, in the noughties, even the early 2010s. And to be honest, it still is a dominant view in some circles, especially in Germany. In some mainstream political circles in Germany, I still hear that kind of idea that this is just a bump in the road. Or turning to the US now, that the US will always be a democracy, and Trump is just, I'm quoting an exact word that I heard from a minister, a hitch. I'm sorry, it's not a hitch. And we need to be able to make Europe in a world of bullies. That means two things. That means first having a very clear objective. Sorry, I'm thinking in French, and in the French military, we say état final recherché, which is a precise definition, which means, can you describe what is your stated end game? Where do you want to go? And we already did that, and von der Leyen during her first mandate did that as the Green Deal. And I 100% support all the Green Deal policies that von der Leyen push forward. But now, obviously, the Green Deal is under attack by the far right. The fact that they are attacked by the people that are pro-Putin and pro-Trump is not a coincidence. So we need to have that final objective. And the second thing is we need to make sure that we suit the action to the word, that we give ourselves the means to achieve that. Virtually all the policies that were adopted during the previous mandate need to be implemented. The only one for which I would make an exception and to make sure that we should have a different and a tailored implementation is the ETS2, which is a de facto European carbon tax on gasoline paid by everyone. I think we need to adopt that policy, but all the rest needs to be fully implemented. And to be honest, I don't see any reason to create regulatory instability. What I fear is that more and more people among the Christian Democrats are, let's say, being kind to those approaches and sometimes even supporting them, which I think is problematic. And it was a clear message from Ursula von der Leyen during a State of the Union address. She said that she wants to have a pro-democracy majority in the European Parliament. And that pro-democracy majority exists. It is the same coalition that has been delivering the Russian gas regulation that I'm currently negotiating. And it's Social Democrats, Greens, Renew, EPP, possibly on some topics, the ECR, whenever they want to side against Russia. So more the Central Eastern ECR than the Italian ECR, to be clear, when it comes to Russia. So that coalition is there. Problem that we have is that sometimes the EPP chooses to do a far-right coalition, what we hear in the parliament call often the Venezuela coalition, because it first appeared on a text on Venezuela. And that coalition is a coalition that, to get a majority, needs to include the AfD, so the German far-right group, that are considered as extremist organization, even by German services, and that are Russian agents. They've been funded by Russia. They've been supported by Russia for years. And they're also denying the existence of climate change. So we're currently living in that world, and we need to be able to prioritize the threats, Putin is an immediate threat to us, and he wants to literally kidnap our children, because that's what he's doing in Ukraine. And if he's not doing that in Poland, it's not because he thinks that the Poles are different from the Ukrainians. It's mostly because there is a Polish army that, and Putin has not yet tried to test the Polish army. Obviously, Trump is also a significant threat, but it's less immediate. And we still hope that there can be some kind of people that can contain him in the US, whether some pro-European Republicans in the US Congress, but also the midterms are coming up soon. And also Trump has a short attention span, so maybe he's going to focusing on other areas of the world.
To throw another wrench into the bigger policy discussion, the fossil fuel industry also has a lot of leverage over the kinds of political decisions that get taken, and also a lot of influence over some of your colleagues here in the European Parliament. So I'm wondering how it's possible to try to disrupt the fossil fuel industry's lobby and give renewables and European initiatives towards energy creation a fair shot.
First, I would like to state that lobbies by themselves have no leverage. All the leverage that they have is the leverage that policy makers gift them. And from that, thankfully, we're different from the US. If I were a US congressman, I would need to spend 10 to 20 hours a week asking lobbies to give me money for my next campaign. That is the way the US system works. And it's increasingly less of a democracy and more of an oligarchy as a result also of that. Thankfully, that is not the case. I spent 0 second of my life leveraging donations for my campaign. So that is good. And that changes, obviously, the dynamic. What I've seen also a lot is the difference between, there are essentially 2 types of politicians, more or less. Obviously, it's an oversimplification, but some, they don't care about the public policy, and therefore they are very susceptible to be influenced by lobbies. And then there are those that do care about public policy, and either they care and they kind of know their stuff already, which I would put myself in that category for energy, for instance, because I've been a researcher for a decade working on that area. But also, they may not be experts, but they care about the policy and they want to learn, and they're going to invest the time. And I would also put myself in that category, but just for other topics, like, for instance, biodiversity protection, which is a topic that is dear to my heart, but has not been my main area of expertise for 10 years. And there are a lot of policymakers in the European Parliament, especially in pro-democracy groups, that are in the camp of people that care about public policy. And here, it's much harder for any lobby to influence them, just because rather than encountering a total vacuum, they encounter an MEP that has, to some extent at least, a clear idea of which type of policy he or she wants to see the EU adopt. And then, obviously, the fossil fuel lobby is powerful. They're well-funded. They have a lot of money because the oil companies are making a lot of money. They're making a lot of money because the oil market is not a free market. The oil market is a cartel, a little bit like a drug cartel from that perspective, and that is controlled by very powerful states like Saudi Arabia, that is the de facto leader of OPEC. And this is public information. There are, I think, almost 1,000 lobbyists that are just working for fossil gas in Brussels, according to the official registry. Maybe it's not 1,000, maybe it's 700, but clearly it's likely that there are more fossil gas lobbyists than there are MEPs in Brussels. All of that is legal, by the way. I think what we need to do as policymakers, we need to do a couple of things. The first one is to ensure that we have better laws to fight against lack of transparency and to fight against corruption. That is important. We are social democrats after the Qatar Gate. We've been asking the European Parliament to reform those laws. Unfortunately, our Christian Democrat colleagues chose to side with the far right to block any kind of improvement there, which I think is not only bad for Parliament, I think it's bad for democracy, and I think it even goes against Christian democratic values because, last time I checked in the Bible, lying was and was not a right thing, and not being transparent was also not something that was advocated by that book. So we still need to fight for that, and speaking about it, having citizens being more active on that, and civil society organizations like Transparency International, to name just one, but there are many others that are fighting for this, is key, because in a democracy, elected officials need to be accountable, and therefore we need to be transparent, and we need more transparency in policymaking in the EU. Just to be clear, the situation is worse in France. So the EU, from, let's say, in terms of managing lobby influence, the EU has been doing a better job than my own country, unfortunately. The second thing that we need is to, or at least the second thing that I do, is to make sure that we talk to companies but not to lobbyists. And by that, what I mean is, it's fine to have someone that has studied political science and has been in Brussels for 30 years lecturing me about how a company works, but they don't really know, like they work for a company, but they've never been the CIO or the CFO or the CTO or even the CEO of any kind of company. I know what training they got because I'm still teaching, and I'm one of the teachers. Like some of the lobbyists that I see used to be my students when I was teaching at Sciences Po Paris or at the College of Europe. So so the time that I'm spending is to try to find other people within companies, and usually the best way is to directly go on site. So for instance, just to give that example, I've been in my home region of Normandy, where I live when I'm not in Brussels or in Strasbourg. I've visited the trucks factory of Renault trucks. So it's called Renault. The brand is called Renault, but it's actually Volvo that owns everything. So it's let's call Volvo a Swedish company that has its big truck factory like 5 kilometers to where I live, close to Caen. And I went twice already in the factory, and I was discussing directly with the director of the factory, who is managing, I don't know, like 2,000 workers. And the type of information that he gives me, the type of question that I can ask him, are so valuable, and much, much, much more valuable than what a Brussels-based lobbyist can tell me. So to me, that's kind of the answer. I would be saying, or at least what I'm trying to do, and many of my colleagues in the parliament are trying to do, is to spend quality time with people that are working inside the private economy. That does not mean just listening to lobbyists in Brussels. That means also making the effort to meet other people than just the lobbyist. People that have a view of the strategy of the company that goes beyond, the next regulatory or implementing act, which, is an important and can be a very important piece of the puzzle, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. And what we need as policymakers is to understand the puzzle, not just the one piece that is the one that is currently sitting on our desk. And I think at least that's what we're trying to do with the Clean Tech Friendship Group, and we are successful actually in doing that. Trying to do this either with an MEP going alone, which I do, but also with small groups of MEPs going together. And this is super, I think, useful for the European process itself, the European integration process itself, because then we come back to Brussels and we have the same diagnosis because we saw the same things and we saw the same people. And then we can debate among ourselves what is the best public policy to address that. And here we would have disagreements, but they would be constructive disagreements funded on a shared understanding of the situation, and obviously a classically normal political and democratic debate on what is the best solution to solve a problem on which we agree that it is that particular problem and that it is solving.
At the start of our Climate and Energy Summit in mid-September, we had a message from Commissioner Jorgensen about getting people to think what they personally can do to help the green transition in the short term. Like, what can you do now? Not big plans, not vision, but really concretely. So I'm wondering, what are your priorities towards accelerating the green transition?
There's so many things to say. I'll just stick to one, and it's maybe one that resonates more with the French situation. We need more public support for onshore wind. In France, we have had many people first coming from the far right, but then right wing, and even people that are so-called centrist that are opposing onshore wind out of ideology. Yeah, it worried me. So I was doing one of those site visits. I was going alone then in my home region of in Normandy, and with my local assistant, he drove me to a small village called Le Manoir, which is for the people that know Normandy, is between Bayeux and Romanche. So it's quite close to the sea, but still inland. And it's a very rural village. Like they are around, 300, 400 inhabitants there. And the wind is quite powerful in that part of the Normandy. And it's one of the very few areas in Normandy where we can legally have onshore wind, because we've got two very, very big military bases, two different places in Normandy. And because of specific military legislation that have to do with radars, you can't put onshore wind too close to them. So I'm going there. I see the mayor, and he told me that it was I'm so happy you came. And I was like, okay, yeah, me too. Like, but why? It's like, because, and that's the word of the mayor, here again, rural area, and he's saying, I've been, pardon my French, but busting my ass off for years now, because I want to have 5 wind turbines on my village. I want to do this because we need to generate energy here at home. We need to make sure that energy is good for our children, and it's decarbonized energy, and onshore wind is part of that. And also, this is a way to make sure that we create jobs locally, and that we also have revenues for the city. And those revenues can be used to do whatever they want. They can subsidize the local baker for that baker to be able to have a van in order to bring bread directly to people's home, especially people that are disabled or people that are too old to drive. You can use that money to renovate the church if it's crumbling, which sadly is the case for many churches in France. You can use that money to renovate, the locker rooms of the local football club. All those concrete things that really, really matter to the people, and for which you need some funding. And the deployment of onshore wind would provide that constant flow of funding to the city. And they told me about the project. It's supported by two developers. One is owned indirectly by the French state, and the other one is a renewable energy community that has been quite important in France. And the project is happening very slowly, because the region, and more importantly, the French government, are throwing, what's the term in English, throwing spokes in the wheel in order to make things a little slow. And there was no local politician, not the mayor from, let's say, the big city close to the commune, neither the local member of the French parliament, that is technically a centrist, by the way. They did not show up. They did not respond to that mayor. I was the only politician to come there in the last 3 years. And what I gather from that is, I think onshore wind is not popular in France. But I think in a democracy, as elected official, what we need to do is to have, let's say, the minimum modicum of courage to be able to stand up for things, even when they're not popular, but that we know are the right things to do, especially when standing up just means supporting a local initiative. That should really be, it is really a story that should be a smooth sailing. It's really a story that should have been should have been 100% okay, but because of ideological choices that were made, it's going way, way, way too slow. And so to me, standing up for onshore wind, precisely because it is the least popular of all renewable energy, is a way to make sure that we move the clean energy transition forward. Because obviously, if we accept onshore wind, we accept all the rest. So I'm not picking that fight because it is an easy one. I'm precisely picking that one because it is a harder one to wage. But if we win on that, we win on the rest. And that's what we need.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pellerin-Carlin. It was really an honor and an educational experience, although maybe I say this about too many episodes, but it's really such a joy to get to learn from really trusted experts on these topics. So if you also learned something, or if you'd like to leave a comment related to something that really got you thinking from this episode, feel free to head on over to LinkedIn or Instagram. That's usually where we post about our episodes. You'll hear from me next time. Until then, have a nice week.